arrive. The world is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. InsideAnalysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com.
InsideAnalysis.com.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
You're so inclined, can go there in your mind. Welcome to the future of that time. It's a positive explosion, so slow the mind motion. We have all been chosen to be here. Easy to forget the ones and things. Rolling in the future of time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Hello and welcome back once again to the only coast-to-coast radio show in the U.S. of A. that's all about the information economy. It's called Inside Analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here. And folks, we have a fantastic show lined up for you today. We've got an old friend of mine and some new friends of his doing very, very interesting work, really shepherding out a whole new kind of model for building businesses. And lots of people are entrepreneurs. Wouldn't it be great if you could sort of grease the tracks to take your big idea and turn it into a company that's making money, employing people, but do so in a shorter period of time, not 3 to 10 years, but like 3 to 10 months or something like that. Really leveraging all the latest capabilities like analytics, like artificial intelligence, getting good salespeople. What kind of model would that look like? Well, there's a company called Nobody Studios. When I heard the name, I initially thought of my favorite poem, I'm Nobody, Who Are You? Are you nobody too? Then they're just us two, right? It's a beautiful poem. I think Emily Dickinson maybe wrote it a long time ago. It really kind of shaped my childhood. Frankly, I was like, wow, there's someone else out there who's wondering. I mean, I'm such a crazy kid. I used to sit around and think to myself, who am I? And why am I me? Why aren't I someone else? And if I were someone else, would I know that I was someone else? Or I would just think that I was me? I mean, that's the thoughts that were spinning in this 7-year-old head many years ago. But let's get to our story here. Nobody Studios. I think it's a fantastic concept. We'll hear from my friend Donald Farmer, along with Mark McNally and Barry O'Reilly. And let's see, Mark, I'll throw it over to you first, because you and I were chatting before the show here. And you've been a startup guy for many, many years. You've got the stories, the war stories to tell about it. And you realize there's a better way to do this sort of incubator model. There's a better way to enable people to take their good ideas and convert them into reality. And you just got rolling yourself. So tell us a bit about the origin story and the whole VC angle on things.
Yeah, Eric. So thank you, first of all, for having us on the show. Super honored to be here. Yeah, so my backstory is, I've done startups my whole entire life. So I've done 14 different startups. I think my very first one was the IPO. So I took it from literally a couple guys in the warehouse to writing the S1, doing the road show, and taking it public in 1999. Got to about a $4.5 billion market cap. So as 25-year-old Mark, I was like, hey, this is kind of cool. I should keep doing this, right? I built plenty of character when the market corrected itself. In .com 1.0, but I just love the concept of trying to change the world, point to something that is probably irrational, bring together people. I think the startup vehicle is the best vehicle I know where normal people have a chance to still change the world, right? And bring the resources together and give a good shot at it. So I've been doing it ever since. I've had 1,400 startups where I was a CEO or founding executive. About a third of those had successful exits. About a third of those did not work out. And about a third of those are still out there. So I've just learned a lot along the way. And, a couple of years ago, I was in this moment where I took a little time off to focus on health and family and other things. But I was also reflecting on what am I going to do next? And I wasn't really willing to do just another company. I wanted to do something that was going to define me. And was going to, make my boys proud and have a chance to change the world for a better thing. And I had to look at what I've been doing my entire career. And the reflections, let's put it that way, the reflections on things we got right or things we got wrong on that journey led into this belief that there's a different way to build companies, that you could build them more aggressively, you could build them more frugally, you could have more people involved than are normal, at least the traditional way. And it happened to be at a time a couple of years ago where everybody was focused on a unicorn or bust. I've always been in this cycle where people reach out to me and say, hey, you want to angel invest in my company, or you want to be a mentor, or do you want to be a consultant? And I started to see this concentration 3 or 4 years ago where every single person that reached out to me, the first hour, they would talk about how they're going to be the next unicorn. And they wouldn't tell me anything about their business or their product or their features or their revenue model. They're just going to reach some kind of valuation. And that was kind of the trigger point for me. I'm like, there's a different way. And here we are.
Yeah. And you mentioned a couple of really cool observations that you've had about the industry and about the amount of money that is typically raised in a Series A versus a Series B. And then do you get the sweet spot for acquisition or merger, which is like under 250 million, I think you said. And
that's right.
What's
so
kind of happening? You go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the headline, right? So people don't realize that the best possible exit for stakeholders and, early founders is likely going to be an acquisition. Like, we all fantasize about an IPO and going the distance. But when you think about the paradigm shifts that are going on with robotics and AI and stuff, like, whatever you decide to do for 10 or 15 years is going to be so disrupted, even if you're a disruptor, right?
Right.
So the best thing you can do is make small disruptions. Add value, take your exit, move on to the next one. That's our thesis, right? Doesn't mean we don't build great companies. We don't build great companies with metrics and revenue and features. It just means if you overfinance, you're in trouble. And so people don't realize that, right? So the average acquisition happens under $250 million, like 80%. So you just raised $10 million on a $40 million pre-money valuation. The company's now worth 50. Everyone on the board wants a 10x. So now they're expecting a $500 million plus exit. But if you ask most founders who just raised $10 million, would you take $100 million cash right now for your company? They say, I don't know if I'd take 100, but I'd take 150 or 200. But they don't realize they could never take that if they wanted to.
Yeah.
Like, they don't actually understand the way the cap table is going to play out. Right. So it's just, there's a lot of dry powder in terms of private equity. There's a lot of capital in terms of publicly traded companies that realize they can't innovate fast enough, and they will acquire aggressively. And yet what we're creating in terms of early stage companies are so overcapitalized, they're missing the mark. So
that's interesting. And
that's
so
our thesis.
It's like golden handcuffs, right? The concept of golden handcuffs, essentially. You're tied down.
Basically.
Yeah.
Basically. So we're very disciplined in our cap tables in terms of how we raise our capital. We always want to, we're super thrilled. You can inspect our financial model. You'll see that there's not a single unicorn in our financial model. We expect it. I'm sure that's going to happen. It's just not modeled, right? We want to make sure that we're very focused on building good, high quality, early stage companies and open to the next exit, or at least the next investor taking it and let it grow.
Yeah, that's very clever, I have to say. And, we are in this sort of boom bust cycle right now. You see things go way up, and of course they come way down, and then they go way up again. And that's very disruptive in and of itself. And it's very incongruous, I guess, and discombobulating. Maybe that's the word. And you seem to be taking much more of a measured approach, trying to make sure that you get the money to raise. And we'll talk about crowdfunding here in a second, and make sure the ideas are good, and focus on offering your advice of what a company needs today to survive, because it's a very, very different market. I mean, it's changing by the day too. You look at social media versus traditional outreach, like print ads versus webinars, it's a very different thing. And it's constantly moving. And to the untrained eye, you can get fooled on a lot of stuff, whether it's social media metrics or what we should expect from a salesperson. You have a lot of that knowledge baked into the people that you have around you, right? To kind of help make sure people don't make some of the obvious mistakes in the early days. Is that about right?
It is. And I think that the most amazing thing to me is realizing that we really get baked into what worked in the past, right? And so this is what worked 10 years ago, or this is what worked 15 years ago. And we're looking forward to a future that is moving so fast and changing so fast that if you can't embrace that culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I really do believe in venture capital is they're brethren to us, right? We're trying to create companies that they want to fund. And we have great relationships with VCs that understand what's going on, right? And they're going to be super happy to work with our companies if they're, they have the right merit. What I think is mainly happening is that we don't understand the speed of innovation and how fast things are going to change. And so this idea of like, hey, there's a seed stage and a series A and a series B and a series C, and that whole model has been broken, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's been radically broken.
Mm-hmm.
And so the gap right now is there's not a lot of high quality early stage companies, right? And so we're just trying to fill that gap, right? We're really just trying to innovate in that space and say we're going to get disciplined in how we build good companies, and something that Barry's an expert in, and some of the people that are founders of the company. Like, we're just, how do you innovate fast? How do you not overthink the perfect product model? How do you not overthink the perfect business model, but just go that way?
Mm-hmm.
Go that way. I think it's that direction we're trying to go. Let's go. Pack up the car. Let's go. We'll figure it out along the way. And I think that's something that we are trying to embody as a studio, and it's a work in progress, but we
Wow.
know that's the future.
This is very cool. We're talking to Nobody Studios. Let's bring in Barry O'Reilly. And you had mentioned something in the pre-call that was very interesting around systems, using systems to train people, to find the right candidates. I mean, there are all sorts of mechanisms that have been used over the years, from different tests, psychological tests, all kind of stuff that you can do. But tell us about your ideas of systems and how you can sort of responsibly grow companies and shepherd them in the right direction.
Yeah, well, one of the things, first of all, when they hear us about a venture studio, people try to understand what that actually is. Sometimes people think we're a venture capitalist, which was true, but then some, where they often think we're just an incubator or an accelerator. And really what it is we bring all those things together into one entity specifically designed for early stage businesses. So we raise our own capital so we can invest in ideas we believe in, teams we believe in. We are an incubator in terms of we help nurture early stage businesses' ideas. And the acceleration comes as us as co-founders of those businesses to help the entrepreneurs get off the ground quickly. Now, to build these types of companies and offer, if you will, capabilities to those startups to help them go faster, that's where we start to build those up within the studio. So capabilities might be intellectual property rights management. You have a new idea. How do you protect the IP for that? Actually, we just announced a team joining us to studio this week called the Adjacent Possible, a team that worked in IBM for years and had numerous patents that they've done and offered that service. So that's one example of a capability now that every company that joins Nobody Studio will have instant access to, ways to protect and manage their intellectual property rights for their ideas. But there's a suite of other capabilities they need, everything from traditional sales, marketing, hiring, capital raising. And these are often areas that take a lot of sort of time, first of all, for entrepreneurs to learn and understand and build networks in and become competent at. But really what the studio is doing is offering those at high quality from the beginning. But it doesn't end there for us. We actually think about these capabilities as companies, if you will, in their own right. So if we need these capabilities within our business to support our startups, you can bet that there's other startups and businesses out there that need the same capabilities. But the benefit of the studio is that we can instantly sort of get the early customers for those capabilities from the businesses that are in our portfolio. So we can learn very fast what works and what doesn't to support those businesses. And then once we get it to a point that we're confident, we can sort of flip it and make it externally available to other businesses. And again, the Adjacent Possible is just another great example of just one of these building block companies that we have in our portfolio. Because what startup doesn't need to protect their intellectual property rights? What startup wouldn't like to know if there's a concentration of patents in an area that they're trying to innovate in or not, right? We have a team or a company that is specifically designed to do that service. So first instance, it serves the studio, but very quickly we'll be able to offer that service to other startups. So it just gives you a sense of some of the magic, if you will, about how we're being really thoughtful not only about the companies that we want to create, the great ideas we have, but also turning the capabilities we need into companies. And there's sort of a suite of examples I can also share of other companies in our portfolio that allow us to do that.
Yeah, this is really cool. And, there's so many interesting aspects that we can explore here, but I'll throw one big one at you, and we're almost up at our first segment, but the great resignation, as it's been called, right? And coming out of COVID, and what's going on there? Well, a lot of people had time to reflect, first of all, and realize what they want to do with their lives. And I think that one of the real sticking issues here is ownership. And I don't mean owning it all yourself. There is that model, of course, to own a business or partnerships, et cetera. But young people, I think if they had an opportunity, if they knew, all right, if I work for you, you're going to give me a little piece of this company. Maybe it's 1%, maybe it's 2%, but then at least it's partially mine. And so you're not just working for someone else, you're working for yourself with other people. That is a very different dynamic. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the really unique parts about what we offer in the studio, right? It's people who get involved in these companies in the very beginning have a chance to own almost amount of equity in those businesses that you're describing from the very earliest stage. And we're big believers that if you're contributing to the idea, you should own a huge part of it. But again, we don't stop just with the company you're working on. By design, anyone who works on a Nobody Studios company earns equity both in the company they're working on and the studio itself. So you're sort of instantly diversified from the very beginning. And even if the company you try to work on, doesn't come to an outcome, we actually realize that we had the idea wrong, or we need to pivot it or and do something different. You've still earned the equity in Nobody Studios, regardless of how that new co starts. And you can go back and work on another company and take all the learnings and go again. So we've really tried to create an incentive system that encourages people to own as much of the companies as possible, to be diversified. And I think that's very, very unique in terms of any incentive system I've ever come across in my life. So again, we're very proud to offer that to people.
Yeah, I think that's very clever. And it's almost like a new variation on the 401k, right? And the 401k, as I recall, was designed to be for private industry folks who don't get pensions, like cops and teachers and government officials, et cetera. I mean, they get pensions. And the 401k was designed to kind of mimic that, but it has some troubles too. We'll pick this up after the break, folks, talking to some very interesting people from Nobody Studios about a new way to build businesses. We'll be right back. You are listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Take us to the future.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, back here on Inside Analysis. I love that song, Take Us to the Future, baby. Rad times. And someone who has got a good perspective on the past, knows where he is today, and a good vision into the future is my buddy Donald Farmer of Treehive Strategies, but also of Nobody Studios. And Donald, you're working on some research, and you've been in the tech space for a long time, so you can do research pretty quickly and ascertain useful things, I'm guessing, pretty well. So what are you seeing, and why are you excited about Nobody?
Oh, well, Nobody is one of the most exciting things I've seen in a very long time, and I'm super excited to be doing things like research and innovation there. I think that's tremendously valuable. One of the things about Nobody, which is very different, is that it's not just about having one idea. This is not a case where you have people who've got money and bring an idea to us and we will fund it. I actually think of it as being more generative than that. There is a pool of people, a crowd of people. There are a pool of money. There's a pool of ideas, and when you bring these things together, there's a sort of emergent property of how they all work together. I think Barry did a great job of explaining how within the organization, the capabilities can themselves become business, which can then themselves generate income. The people will get interested in those businesses, and the entire process is sort of snowballs like this. So when you think of research in that context, research is not, I'm trying to find the one breakthrough idea which will be successful. It's actually more about what are the broad areas that we should be looking at where there is untouched potential.
Mm-hmm.
And there may well be areas which are covered by other people, but they've missed opportunities within them, or they've missed what might be the really interesting aspects of it, which is what does this look like when you open it up to the crowd? So that seems to me really, really interesting.
Yeah, you talk about crowd infused as opposed to crowd funded, which is a great term to use because you're not just taking money from people and they get something back for that investment. No, you want to get them involved in processes, get them involved in designing businesses or providing services or whatever, right?
Yeah, it's very different. I mean, crowdfunding, for me, I've been involved in crowdfunding for a very long time, and I've done a lot of microfinance. I've done a lot of crowdfunding, both supporting development of products on well-known platforms like Kickstarter and so on. Even my son works in Scotland. He manages a distillery, and it's crowdfunded by the local community.
It's amazing.
So crowdfunding, yeah, it's really cool. It's a very interesting project in itself. But so crowdfunding is something I am very used to. That's not a surprising idea. When Mark came to me with the idea for Nobody Studios, and I think it was one of the first people he spoke to, I've started to bounce around these ideas, and I was thinking, yeah, crowdfunding, that's an interesting way. And he said, no, it's not crowdfunding. There's more to it than that. There's a lot more to it than that. And it took a little while, but he's very persuasive. But as you know, when the penny dropped for me was when I realized that the crowd runs through the entire process. Somebody who put some money into Nobody Studios and has funded it. What are they doing? Well, they've become a nobody at that point. They're not just somebody who's put some money in or somebody whose ideas matter to the organization. They may well become a customer of the organization because they're actually using the apps. They probably funded is because they like some of the apps that we're building. And as they like some of the apps that are building and they're giving us feedback, they may well have skills which they themselves bring into the studio. And that starts to snowball and starts to become an emergent property of doing more and more of these things. Now, in that context, the traditional model of I've got an idea, I'm asking you for funding, it's not that breaks down, but it becomes something very different. That's why I tend to call it kind of generative finance, because we're all engaged in the ideation, we're all engaged in the innovation, we're all engaged in the research, we're all engaged in the funding, and we're all engaged in achieving something and using the products as well. So, that's a very, very different model.
Well, and there are also all these really interesting facets that I've been thinking about related to this concept, just in terms of organizational hierarchies and the difference between a sort of top-down organizational hierarchy and a community coming together to work on something. I mean, you do need people to take the lead on this project and that project, but it seems to me you're sort of dissolving in a very positive way the traditional, fairly calcified constructs that we think of as organizational hierarchies. Is that right?
Oh, well, this is a real problem in traditional funding. That they impose these hierarchies. One of the things that's most familiar to me, I do a lot of advising, as you know, to startups all over the world, and especially in the technology space. And one of the most traumatic things that you find in a startup is when the CEO is required to move on. The founder and the CEO who had the original idea is moved out of the role because, you know what? It turns out that they may have been a brilliant technologist, they may have been a brilliant developer or whatever, but they're not particularly good at the finance side. They're not particularly good at the business side. They might not be particularly good at the HR side. They might not be particularly good at the marketing side. And yet they've been asked to do all this stuff because that's the way in which we envision hierarchical companies. And why are they doing all that? And a model where people can, bring the skills that they have and bring the input that they have is actually it's a much more fertile model than expecting someone to have one breakthrough idea and execute on it. We can execute on many ideas in parallel. The ideas can feed off each other, and the skills and abilities of the organization can grow in that way.
And so I'm just going to throw out one idea here. You tell me if you think this fits with your vision and what you're talking about. There is so much to be known these days in launching a business, especially a business with a digital component to it. And what I mean is, how to do social media marketing, how to do email marketing, how to do content, how to design your products, how to charge for these things. There are lots of little things to be known. And so in a traditional market, you go out and you hire a PR firm, or you hire a consulting firm, or you hire all these different agencies, which can definitely bring some value. There's no doubt about that, but at a pretty significant price and from the outside. So it's someone from the outside coming in saying, well, you should do X, Y, and Z. And it seems to me that with the right number of people and the right team, you can solve a lot of those problems, because someone who really knows social media can just sit in for 1 hour a week with one company and say, oh, okay, this is good, but I wouldn't do that because these particular stats are misleading, that kind of thing. So you're repurposing people in meaningful ways because that person wants to share their knowledge. I mean, typically, people who gain a lot of knowledge and experience, they like to share that. They want to show you, but there are all these barriers to that happening, whether that be inside, outside the organization or whatever. What do you think? And maybe, Barry, I'll throw this one over to you. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of really interesting points that you bring up there, Eric, right? The real power of us having these capabilities, if you will, whether it's a social media company or someone who can come in and help with very specific expertise, is all the learning is compounded. So if we learn something on one company, a better way to do social media outreach, that lesson then gets compounded across the entire portfolio. So everybody learns together. So the bar is constantly raising, both in terms of how we know how to do these different capabilities, but also how we can support the founders in better ways. And, you know, we're even seeing this with our own sort of, if you will, social media in our company, right? If people go out and look up at nobodystudios.com, they're going to be able to see live streams as well with Donald talking about our research and innovation. They're going to see opportunities to hear Mark talk about why we started the business. They can hear from our CFO about how our financial model works. They can hear from our head of culture to talk about how we work as a business. And these patterns that we're learning ourselves to be transparent and open as a company, then all just get folded into every single company we create. So we create, it's a real force multiplier here to not only leverage what we're learning, but then compound that across the whole portfolio, which again, I think is very exciting. To Donald's point about speed and being able to do things in parallel and at high quality, and then just keep raising the bar as we learn more. We could sort of feed that back into the machine. So it's very exciting. And we're starting to really see some of the returns, if you will, from leveraging our time and effort so far.
One of the things that happens here, Eric, is if you think of a traditional model, all these things that you mentioned, like marketing and social media outreach and so on, if you have an idea, if you have a concept for a product, all of these things become cost centers to you, and they're secondary to building your product. For us, they're not cost centers and they're not secondary because they're primary to another aspect of our business. So if we actually build the business that provides these components, provides these building blocks, provides these platforms, they are primary in another part of the studio. So there's none of this sort of, nothing is a sunken cost center. Everything is generative and new things.
That's very interesting because you're speaking right to the whole concept of cost centers versus profit centers. And do we really need to draw these hard lines of delineation? And the short answer is no, you don't need to do that. I mean, I've seen in big media companies when they'll purchase another media product, for example, and then the story is, okay, shared services, which is fine. And sometimes it works out great. Usually in a traditional shared services model, what happens is a handful of the people who want the service get the bulk of that service because they're the squeaky wheels, and the rest are kind of off to the side or kind of shy or whatever. And so it doesn't really work out. But if it, as you suggest, if every component is generative in and of itself, that's a much different environment. It's like plants that grow well together. They help each other as they grow, right? What do you think?
I think that's a very good image for it. Yeah, it is like the forest where everything is self-reinforcing and self-fertilizing, and the connections and relationships are generative. They're not there as a means of extracting value from one product into another. They're a way of generating the shared value.
Well, and the thing about listening and talking is that listening also is a skill, right? And listening requires effort. It requires attention and focus. And
Sorry, what were you saying?
are we breaking up? You're breaking up, Scotty. And so the reason I'm saying this is because in a collegial environment, and that's my favorite word, collegial environment, people are more open to share their ideas and their thoughts and their opinions about things. And it's not taken as an affront. It's not taken as a criticism, a sort of de facto criticism of what I've been working on. You're just offering some insight. And I see in this orchestration that is much more common and is sort of conducive to the environment. Is that about right?
I think Mark has been extremely deliberate and thoughtful about the culture, especially when it comes to some of these aspects. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about that, about the kind of the cultural drive behind Nobody?
Yeah. No, I think there's probably a few things. And loved watching you guys talk about it and hearing the conversation. It's been awesome. I think we know we have to create a culture that is embracing a few things. One, moving very fast. And I don't think we have it right, Eric. I just know that we are trying to do something that no one else is trying to do. Right? We're going to figure out how to go fast. And we know that the faster we go, the more we're going to break the things that we used to do in our career. And that's what I'm trying to do. Right? That's what I was trying to do when I was in my garage and you could hear my dog barking in the background. Right? I want to break the way we used to build companies. Because I want to create a new way. Now, we're not there, right? I just know that we're probably the only organization that's putting it out there the way we are and saying we're going to figure it out, right? And so that's the second part is we try to teach the organization to think in terms of there is no perfect plan. There's only go that direction and learn.
Yeah.
Right?
That makes a lot of sense.
That's really, really important, but it's different because if you create a culture that's like, that was wrong, gotcha, then you lock yourself in a room and make sure it's perfect before you present it. If you say, I don't know, this is what I'm thinking. What do you guys think? And we make it better along the way. Well, I don't know, it's probably stupid, but let's go that direction and revisit it in a week. Like, I really know that we have to get there. So I can tell you, honestly, as an organization, we're not where we want to be. I just know we're trying to push the boundaries in ways that I've not heard from other people.
Yeah. Well, and you're creative about incentives too. And this is something I learned a number of years ago, and it was really an aha moment. If you take a real strategic view at your organization and figure out how you're incentivizing people, I've seen in the sales world how you could just tip the scales left, right, or any which way based upon the incentives that you give. So you have to be very thoughtful about your incentives. We're coming up on the next break here, but let me just kind of set the tone for the next segment here in describing what I mean. If you give the right incentives for people to collaborate, they're going to collaborate. If you give the right people incentives to sell more, well, obviously they're going to sell more, but at what cost? And so you have to be measured about these things. And what I really like that you mentioned already is that if someone invests, well, they're part of the organization. And if it's their company, they'll do well if that company does well, but they'll do well if the whole company does well also, which is the whole idea about really being bought in. It's the whole idea about partnerships is that we all join and do this together and we all grow together. But folks, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back talking to some experts from Nobody Studios. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, welcome back to Inside Analysis. We're talking to several wonderful people from Nobody Studios, and you can invest in Nobody Studios. You can be a part of Nobody Studios. We can all be nobodies together. And that's great because that's what we want. And we want transparency. You know, I learned from a lady named Maureen Clary about 20 odd years ago. She said that you should tell your employees what everyone makes and you should tell them what you make. she gave a really good reason for it. She said, because if you don't, they're going to guess anyway, and they're almost always going to guess higher than you're really making. So it's like, if you're just honest with people, it'll be lower than they thought. And they're like, really? But people love transparency. You love when you can see what's happening, when you understand, and transparency fosters trust in really deep and enduring ways. And so maybe, Mark, I'll throw it over to you to kind of talk about the transparency on the financials, on the books, on what you get for your money, and keeping investors informed of what's really happening. So just talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I would put this in the category of something that we know we care a lot about. I don't think we haven't figured out yet, right? I just know we said early on, and we've said it always all, that transparency was a core DNA for us, right? Meaning, we'll say, this is what we're trying to figure out. This is what we're getting wrong. This is what we screwed up. This is what keeps us up at night. By the way, we're really excited about this, because if we were going to have a crowd-infused environment, which we've already talked about, then you want to make sure the crowd can engage at the right level, right? Mm-hmm. So someone can invest $100 and just be a passive investor, but they can be a passive investor listening. And if they're listening to things that we care about, or we're trying to figure out, and they see they can add value, or they have an experience that might help, or they have somebody they know in their network that can help, like, that makes us all better. So it came out of my, inspection of 14 companies I've been a part of. And I'm like, what are the things that we did right and wrong? And one of the things I hated the most about all my venture-backed companies was you spend so much time trying to spin a narrative, right? Hey, there's a board meeting coming up in a month. What are we going to say? Hey, we got an employee meeting coming up. What are we going to say? It's like, what do you mean? What are you going to say? Let's just tell the truth, right? And I don't think we've got it right. If I'm being really true, I don't believe we have it right. But we do our absolute best to push the boundaries on that, and we will continue to do that. Because talking out loud about what keeps us up at night and where we need help makes people come out of the woodwork. We've got an amazing group of angels. Now we get a chance to enjoy hundreds or thousands of investors worldwide. So talking out loud makes those people say, hey, I heard you. I have an idea. Or I have someone you should talk to, or have an experience, or have some advice, right? That's the only way to move at the speed we're trying to move at. So do we have it figured out? Nope. But I know we're pushing the boundaries of it.
Well, and there's this concept of psychological security that I learned. I think it was at the UiPath conference a couple of years ago. One of the presenters talked about psychological security, and at first the cynic in me was, give me a break. And then I was like, oh, actually, they're making a good point. So
yeah, right.
Maybe I'll throw it over to Donald to comment on that. There's something very real and palpable about culture and the culture of an organization. And it really pays to be transparent, to be open and honest, and welcoming to people. Now, that doesn't mean you have to let everyone do whatever they want. Of course not. But at least be able to speak your mind about stuff and be open to listening. And that, I think, frankly, it's a critical success factor, right, Donald?
It really is. And it's particularly critical when you're trying to build an organization which is so dependent on culture. Culture isn't a secondary thing here. Culture is part of what drives us. One thing that excites me very much about Nobody is, we have a culture officer, Sejal Kakkar, who is, one of the first people to be, a principal within the company. So that's how important culture is, because we kind of understand that culture drives this. It's not it's not secondary. It's a primary concern of what we do. So yeah, I'm very excited about that. And one of the things that matters to me with my focus on sort of innovation and focus on research is to build a culture of curiosity into the organization. That there's lots of things we can do about velocity, and there's lots of things we can do about being very productive and very creative. But curiosity is a critical part of that too. And we're a very curious organization in every sense of that word.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And maybe I'll bring Barry back into the conversation here.
He's very curious.
Yeah, curiosity
Maybe too curious.
Right. Well, but in a world with scaled out architectures and cloud computing engines and artificial intelligence and chat GBT, for example, curiosity is a very important characteristic to have to get through the day to solve any kind of problem, because there are so many ways you can solve problems these days. I mean, that's the blessing and the curse of the modern world, is that there's no end to the possibilities about how you can address any particular business objective. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, this comes up a lot, right? Like we have an idea lab, which is specific job is to take ideas in from people who are nobody investors or nobodies in general, or just somebody, an entrepreneur who wants to bring their ideas to life. Right? Like we create a process to be curious about these ideas. And, one of the most powerful ways I've found to stay curious, because we listen to a lot of pitches for ideas all the time. And it's very easy to sort of hear and look to sort of critique an idea very much from the beginning. Right? Someone has 1 minute to tell you what their idea is, and you're like, oh, I've heard it before. But what we found, one of the most powerful things is to just give people a few more minutes. Like, tell me more. It's one of the most important questions to ask people. It's like when they put their idea to you, is don't try and close it down.
Right.
Just give them that 90 seconds more, that 30 seconds more, and just say, tell me more. Try to understand more about where they're coming from, rather than just how they presented their first expression, if you will, of the idea. And we have found, even the way you put ideas into the studio, is it's just a series of us asking questions which say, tell me more. Like in the beginning, we asked people to send us, if you will, like a log line and a newspaper front page to explain what would your idea look like if it was on the front of the New York Times or something like this. And then we asked us to tell us more about the idea now. And as we get to know them, it gives them a chance to start expanding on their thinking, what works, what gaps might be. So that's curiosity, to Donald's point, is sort of an imperative for us, because it's very easy to discount ideas. Anyone can sit there and go, yep, heard it before. No, sounds too like another company I know. But if you can just make that little bit of time and space to ask, tell me more, that can have a profound effect, both in helping the person expand their thinking or be more generative, to another one of Donald's points, that you might realize that it could work well with something we're already looking at, or there's a company in our portfolio that could combine with, or so we really work hard in that space. And I think, if you're not in the business of ideas and not being curious and systematically making yourself curious by asking these questions, I think we're doing ourselves and the entrepreneurs a disservice.
Well, and so I'm always thinking. Oh, go ahead.
Sure. I would add one thing, right? Like, I think that in a traditional investor world, it's like everything's binary. This is good or no, right? This is yes or no. And if you think about an R&D environment, everything that you pursue but decide not to go the next level just goes back on the shelf. And you might be in a spot, a year, a day, a month, 2 years, a decade, whatever. You're like, oh my gosh, now there's this breakthrough, this regulatory change, this person. Let's go grab those two things off the shelf. And so everything we do on the ideation in our world becomes an asset value in the long term. Because when we grab it off the shelf and build, like, nothing's lost. I really don't believe anything's lost. But in a lot of worlds, it's all lost.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And, as we wrap up the live portion of our show, we got a podcast bonus coming up next. I'm just going to throw an analogy out there because I think it's very interesting. Think about Shark Tank. A lot of people know what Shark Tank is. There are even Shark Tanks in different countries, and it's all about the people coming in with their great ideas, and it's all the big, tough super millionaires sitting back there looking all cool, like giving them the thumbs up or the thumbs down, like, if we were in the Roman days, or the thumbs down, the lion would come out and take the poor person away. My point is that that's a very tough and sort of confrontational dynamic, which is not at all what you're doing.
And that's how a lot of accelerators work, by the way.
Right. And I believe that.
And so we're not fans of that. There is a certain amount of competition that's important. It brings the best out of people. At the end of the day, though, I think Barry said it really well. I call it being idea whisperers. Like, if you bring us an idea, there's a reason why you're passionate about that.
Yeah.
So if we can get to the core of that, then we can figure out what should be, whether you had it right or not, right?
Yeah.
And so we're passionate about that.
I love that. So I think instead of the Shark Tank, these guys are more like the Shed Aquarium, which is a very peaceful place, lots of coexistence. But podcast bonus segment coming up next. You have been listening to Inside Analysis.